Next, enums. Enums have been around in Java for a long time, since Java 5. But for some reason, many Java developers don't appreciate their benefit, probably because they confuse Java enums with the dramatically less useful form of enums that were in C and C++. So in Java, enums are more or less normal Java classes, but they have a fixed number of named instances. You can't call new on them arbitrarily. You know ahead of time how many instances of the class there are and what their names are. So they don't correspond in any way to numbers, as they did in C++. In fact, that was probably a mistake in Java to call them enums because they're so different than the concept of enums in C++ that developers can't distinguish the two in their mind. So here's a quick example. I declare an enum called month. Month is now a real class, and then I can list the names of the instances ahead of time. So if I list 12 here, then Java makes 12 instances of the month class in advance and gives them names. You can't call new on month later and make a 13th month. And the way to access those instances is to use the class name dot and the enum instance name. All right, that's the basic idea. Let's see why this is so useful. So sometimes you have a class and it has real methods, it has real behavior, but you could only have a fixed number of instances. You're going to implement months. You're going to implement planets. You're going to implement days. You're going to implement the periodic chemical elements. There's a fixed number. You know how many there are ahead of time. And so it makes sense to limit the number and give the names ahead of time. Now, there was often a discussion in the early days of Java of singletons, Java classes for which there can only be one instance. And the way that you implemented singletons in the early days of Java was so difficult and so brittle and so error-prone that it eventually became an anti-pattern. This is what you should not do. Try to implement singletons. But with enums, singletons are not an anti-pattern. It's perfectly reasonable to have a class for which you can only have one instance, and you should use enums for that. So the first reason for enums is when you know ahead of time how many instances there are. And the second benefit of enums is it just makes it easy to do comparisons. You don't have to try to override the equals method. You can just compare instances. And so if you have some method that returns a month based on some runtime information, and you want to say, oh, well, if it's December, realize that, I have a lot of vacations in December and I don't have many working days, I can just compare to December using equals equals. And as we saw briefly earlier, this also means that you can use enums in switch statements to make it convenient. But the real Java classes, unlike in C++, where they correspond to ints behind the scenes in order for them to be used in switch statements. Okay, so here's the big difference from C++ enums. Enums in Java can have methods. Well, of course they can have methods because they're classes. So you have a fixed number of instances of the class, but they can have the normal capabilities of classes. They can have public or private methods. They can have instance variables. Of course, it's the same point. They're normal classes. Of course, you shouldn't have public mutable instance variables. You shouldn't have those in any classes. But they're classes, so they can have methods, they can have instance variables, and they can have constructors. The big difference, though, with constructors is in normal classes, outside code can call this constructors. With enums, you have to limit the number of instances ahead of time. Only inside code can call the constructor. So if you make a constructor in an enum, whenever you declare the name of the instance, you also call the constructor in parentheses. So the constructor can do the normal kinds of things constructors can do, as we discussed earlier, but you can't call the constructor from the outside. You can only call the constructor when you define the enum and give the named instances. Okay, here's a simple example, an enum called day. Think of this as a class called day, but with 7 instances: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. In this particular case, we haven't defined any methods or constructors, but it's still a class. And so to use it, I can refer to the class name day. So I could write a method that says, given a day, determine if it's the weekend. Well, it's easy to do comparisons with enums. You can use equals equals. So I can compare to Saturday and compare to Sunday. And so I could pass in Monday and it'll say, no, it's not a weekend. Or I can pass in Saturday, and it'll say, yes, it is a weekend. So don't be scared off by enums. They're quite simple. They're just classes that have a fixed number of named instances, which lets you limit the number of instances and makes it easy to do comparisons. Enums are classes. Classes can have methods, so enums can have methods. So in the last example, we had a separate static method to which you passed an enum to determine if it was the weekend. Well, that's kind of silly. The natural way in object-oriented programming is to put that method in the class itself. And so we can do that. We can make a method called isWeekend. Am I Saturday or Sunday? And then I can look up an instance and call the method on it. And so it'll say no if you call isWeekend on day.Monday, and it'll say yes if you call isWeekend on day.Saturday. So enums are classes. Classes can have methods. Enums can have methods. Enums can also have constructors. But now the syntax is a little bit tricky because it's illegal for outside code to call new on an enum because there's a fixed number of instances. So we still make a constructor, but we declare it to be private. That's a little bit strange. What's the purpose of having a constructor if it's private? Answer, because inside code can call it. And so now, whenever you declare a named instance, you also pass in the constructor arguments. So this still says there are 7 predefined named instances of the day class, or enum. But whenever you instantiate Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, I pass in some constructor arguments. And in this case, I store an abbreviation for the day. And I can then get an enum, call a getter method on it, and it'll output something based on what was passed to the constructor.